The Cumberland Hotel in London is a massive limestone fortress overlooking Marble Arch, a place where tourists and businessmen mix in the anonymity of the metropolis. But on a rainy afternoon in early 1960, the most interesting man in the lobby was not a diplomat or a tycoon. He was a balding, middle-aged civil servant with the thick spectacles and the flushed complexion of a man who drank his lunch. His name was Harry Houghton. To the casual observer, he looked like 1,000 other bureaucratic drones who shuffled papers for Her Majesty's government. He wore a cheap suit that didn't quite fit, and he had the rough, loud manner of a man trying too hard to be the life of the party. But if you looked closer as the MI5 surveillance team, hidden behind newspapers in the lobby, was doing, you saw the cracks in the facade. Houghton was a clerk. His official salary at the underwater detection establishment in Portland was barely enough to cover rent and a weekly roast beef dinner. Yet here he was in one of London's busiest hotels, peeling banknotes off a thick roll of cash like a gangster. He was buying rounds of double whiskeys for strangers. He was talking too loudly about his important work for the Navy. He was a man, vibrating with the manic energy of a secret he was desperate to tell but paid to keep. Houghton checked his watch, drained his glass, and walked out into the London drizzle. He didn't head for a government office. He walked toward a rendezvous that would eventually bring down the most sophisticated Soviet spy network ever discovered on British soil. He was the weak link, the rusted bolt in a machine of high-tech espionage. The KGB called him a useful idiot. The British Security Service called him a traitor. But to the regulars at his local pub back in Dorset, he was just Harry, the guy who always had money and never explained where it came from. The path that brought Harry Houghton to that street corner in London began not with ideology, but with a bottle. Houghton had served in the Royal Navy during the war, but he wasn't a hero. He was a survivor, a man who had scraped by in the lower decks, learning that the world belonged to those who took what they wanted. After the war, he had been posted to the British Embassy in Warsaw, Poland. It was a hardship post, a bleak landscape of communist gray, but for Houghton, it was a paradise. A black market was thriving. Coffee, nylons, and penicillin could be traded for vodka and cash. Houghton dove into the corruption with enthusiasm. He began to drink heavily. He began to trade. And somewhere in the haze of a Warsaw winter, he made a mistake. He got caught in a black market deal, or perhaps a honey trap. The details remain buried in the KGB archives, but the result was simple. The Soviets owned him. When he was sent back to England in the early 1950s, the KGB didn't let him go. They looked at his file. They saw a man who was greedy, resentful of authority, and addicted to alcohol. They saw the perfect asset. They helped him get a job as a clerk at the underwater detection establishment, UDA, on the Isle of Portland. It sounded like a boring administrative post, but the UDE was actually the brain of the Royal Navy. It was where the British were developing the next generation of sonar, the Dreadnought nuclear submarine technology, and the top-secret homing torpedoes that were supposed to counter the massive Soviet submarine fleet. Harry Houghton, the drunk clerk, was placed right in the center of the vault. He had access to the test results. He had access to the manuals. And most importantly, he had a burning need for cash to fund his lifestyle of whiskey and flashy cars. The Isle of Portland is a strange, stark limestone rock jutting out into the English Channel, connected to the mainland by the thin shingle strip of Chesil Beach. In 1960, it was a closed world. The naval base dominated the economy. Everyone knew everyone. It was a place where secrets were supposed to be safe, because outsiders were instantly visible. But secrets are hard to keep when you are buying rounds for the house. Houghton's behavior in Portland was becoming a local legend. He was driving a brand new car, a Vauxhall, at a time when most clerks took the bus. He was renovating his cottage. He was seen dining at the best restaurants in Weymouth, ordering champagne, His colleagues whispered. They knew what a clerk earned. The math didn't work. Some thought he had won the football pools. Others thought he was running a black market business on the side, selling stolen naval supplies, but nobody reported him. In the rigid class structure of 1950s Britain, you didn't snitch on a mate, even if he was a bit of a spiv. But the anomaly was too big to ignore forever. The tip-off didn't come from a high-tech surveillance sweep. It came, as these things often do, from a personal grudge. Houghton's ex-wife, who had suffered through his drunken rages and beatings, eventually went to the authorities. She didn't talk about spies. She talked about the money. She told a welfare officer that Harry was bringing home bundles of pound notes. She mentioned that he sometimes talked about friends in London who looked after him. The welfare officer passed the comment to the police. The police passed it to the Admiralty. And the Admiralty, sensing a security leak, passed it to MI5. When the Watchers Mi-5's elite surveillance team arrived in Portland, they expected to find a petty thief. They expected to find Harry Houghton stealing copper wire or selling diesel fuel. They set up observation posts. They tapped his phone. They followed him to the pub. What they saw was confusing. Houghton wasn't stealing physical goods. He was stealing paper, and he wasn't selling it to local scrap dealers. He was taking the train to London on the first Saturday of every month. The Watchers followed him on one of these trips. They watched him get off at Waterloo Station. They watched him wait on a street corner. And then they saw the contact. He wasn't a shadowy figure in a trench coat. He was a confident, handsome man who looked like an American businessman. He drove a Studebaker. He laughed with Houghton, clapped him on the shoulder, and handed him a parcel. The two men went to a cafe, exchanged envelopes, and parted ways. Mi-5 ran a trace on the American. His name, according to his passport, was Commander Gordon Lonsdale, a Canadian businessman who ran a company selling jukeboxes and bubble gum machines in London. He was a popular man about town, a ladies' man, a fixture of the London party scene. But when MI5 dug deeper into Gordon Lonsdale, the picture began to blur. His company was a shell. His Canadian accent had a strange inflection, and on the days he wasn't selling jukeboxes, he was seen taking long, circuitous routes through the suburbs, checking for tails, and visiting a modest bungalow in Ruislip. The Watchers realized with a jolt of adrenaline that they weren't looking at a black market ring. They were looking at an illegal, a deep-cover Soviet intelligence officer operating without diplomatic immunity. Harry Houghton, the drunk clerk, was meeting with a master spy. Back in Portland, Houghton was not working alone. The KGB, realizing that a drunk clerk might not be the most reliable photographer of technical documents, had ordered him to find a partner. Houghton didn't have to look far. He looked across the office at Ethel G. Ethel was a tragic figure. A spinster in her late 40s, she lived a small, cramped life caring for her elderly, demanding relatives. She was lonely. She was invisible. And she worked in the filing room, where the most sensitive documents were stored. Houghton, using his rough charm, began to court her. He didn't offer her love. He offered her escape. He took her to dinners. He bought her gifts. And eventually, he told her his secret. He didn't tell her he was a Soviet spy. That would have been too much for a patriotic Englishwoman. He spun a lie. He told her he was working for an American naval commander, Gordon Lonsdale, who needed information to help the British Navy coordinate with the U.S. Navy against the Russians. He claimed the British bureaucracy was too slow, so Gordon needed the documents under the table to speed things up. It was a ridiculous story, but Ethel G. wanted to believe it. She wanted to be part of something exciting. She wanted to help Harry, so she began to steal. Every Friday, Ethel G. would go into the secure vault. She would pull the files on the Dreadnought submarine, the homing torpedoes, and the sonar arrays. She would tuck the documents into her shopping bag, underneath the vegetables and the knitting. She would walk out of the base, past the guards who never searched the bag of a middle-aged woman, and meet Harry. They would spend the weekend photographing the documents with a camera Houghton had been given by Lonsdale. Then they would return the files on Monday morning. It was a rhythm of treason that went on for months. The bun, as they called the stolen intelligence, was fresh and hot. The MI5 watchers watched this courtship with cold fascination. They saw the two middle-aged lovers walking along the seafront, holding hands. They saw the shopping bags. They saw the trips to London. They knew they had enough to arrest them. But the service held back. They wanted the big fish. They wanted Lonsdale. And more importantly, they wanted to know who Lonsdale was reporting to. Gordon Lonsdale was a ghost. He moved through London with an ease that baffled the surveillance teams. He had no visible connection to the Soviet embassy. He didn't meet with diplomats. He didn't go to dead drops in parks. Instead, he went to 45 Cranley Drive in Ruislip, a quiet, leafy suburb full of accountants and retired teachers. The house belonged to a couple named Peter and Helen Kroger. They were antique book dealers. They were a pleasant, elderly couple from New Zealand, or maybe Canada. The neighbors weren't sure. Peter was a bookish, quiet man who spent his time in the garden. Helen was a bustling, friendly woman who baked cakes for the neighbors. They were the perfect suburbanites. But when Lonsdale visited, he didn't buy books. He stayed for hours. Sometimes he stayed overnight. MI5 set up an observation post in the house across the street. They used long-range lenses to peer into the windows of 45 Cranley Drive. They saw strange things. They saw the Krogers and Lonsdale working late into the night with the curtains drawn tight. They saw heavy electrical usage. They saw Lonsdale arriving with packages and leaving empty-handed. The watchers began to suspect that the Krogers were not book dealers. They were the technical support. They were the radio operators. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifying. You had a clerk in Portland stealing the secrets of nuclear warfare. You had a Canadian businessman acting as the courier and controller. And you had a New Zealand couple in Ruislip running what appeared to be a high-speed transmission station. It was a fully integrated spy ring, a self-contained cell that could operate indefinitely without ever contacting Moscow directly. And the only reason MI5 knew about any of it was because Harry Houghton liked to buy whiskey. By late 1960, the tension in the investigation was reaching a breaking point. Houghton was getting worse. His drinking was spiraling out of control. He was becoming aggressive with FLG. He was starting to talk crazy in the pubs, hinting that he was going to blow the lid off everything. The KGB, sensing the danger, told Lonsdale to cool the operation down. But Lonsdale was greedy too. He wanted one last big haul of documents on the new nuclear submarine reactor. He arranged a meeting. Saturday, January 7th, 1961, Waterloo Station. MI5 knew the schedule. They knew Houghton and G would be on the train from Salisbury. They knew Lonsdale would be driving his Studebaker. The trap was set. But traps are messy things, especially when your target is a drunk who might miss his train, or a master spy who has a sixth sense for danger. Friday, January 6th, 1961. Harry Houghton and Ethel G met in the car park outside the underwater detection establishment. The wind was whipping off the English Channel, cold and biting. Ethel was carrying a straw shopping bag. Inside, nestled beneath her weekend groceries, were 4 Admiralty test pamphlets dealing with the specific frequency ranges of a new British sonar. It was the crown jewels of anti-submarine warfare. You got M? Houghton asked, his breath clouding in the cold air. I got, Harry, Ethel said nervously. But I don't like it. People are looking at me. Don't worry, old girl, Harry said, patting her arm. One more trip to London. We see Gordon. We get the cash. Then maybe we take a holiday. Spain, maybe. He was lying, of course. There would be no Spain. The money he got from Lonsdale was already spent on vodka and car repairs. But he needed Ethel to stay calm. He needed her to get on that train. That night, Houghton sat in his cottage, drinking. He looked at the stolen documents. He didn't understand the science graphs of decibels and hertz. Meant nothing to him. But he knew they were worth a fortune. He felt a surge of power. He, the lowly clerk, the man the officers looked down on, was holding the Navy by the throat. He poured another drink. He didn't notice the car parked down the lane, the two men sitting in the dark, watching his window. He didn't know that his name was already typed on a warrant sitting on a desk in Scotland Yard. He raised his glass to the empty room. To the Queen, he muttered, laughing at his own joke. The drunk clerk was about to go on his final trip. Saturday, January 7th, 1961. Waterloo Station, London. A station was a cathedral of smoke and noise, the air thick with the smell of diesel and the damp wool of thousands of commuters. It was the frantic heart of the weekend exodus, a place where anonymity should have been easy. But on this particular afternoon, the crowd was not as random as it appeared. Dotted among the families and soldiers were men in trench coats who were not waiting for a train. They were special branch detectives and MI5 watchers, moving in a choreographed ballet of surveillance. They were reading newspapers they had already read, checking watches that were perfectly synchronized, and waiting for the 12:32 p.m. train from Salisbury to arrive at Platform 10. When the train hissed to a halt, the doors slammed open, and the passengers spilled out. Among them was a mismatched couple who looked like tourists on a day trip. Harry Houghton, red-faced and jittery, wore a trilby hat that sat uneasily on his head. Beside him, Ethel G. looked mousy and anxious, clutching a straw shopping bag tightly against her coat. To the casual observer, the bag might have contained sandwiches or knitting. To the men watching from the ticket barriers, it was a radioactive object. They knew that buried beneath the mundane clutter of Ethel's life were the specifics of the Royal Navy's nuclear deterrent. Houghton and G. walked through the ticket barrier and out onto the street. They didn't hail a taxi. They waited. The tension on the street corner was palpable to everyone except the targets. Houghton lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. The tremors of a hangover or the thrill of the treason, it was hard to tell. A few minutes later, a sleek Studebaker pulled up to the curb. The driver was Gordon Lonsdale. He looked every inch the successful businessman. Confident, smiling, wearing a camel haircoat. He parked the car and walked toward them. There was no cloak-and-dagger paranoia in his movements. He greeted them with the warmth of a nephew meeting his favorite aunt and uncle. The three of them walked together toward the old Vic Theater, chatting, laughing. Lonsdale took the shopping bag from Ethel. It was a chivalrous gesture, but in the eyes of the law, it was the transfer of the corpus delicti, the body of the crime. At that moment, Superintendent George Smith of Special Branch, a man with the weary face of a veteran hunter, stepped out from the shadows. He didn't run. He walked briskly, flanked by two other detectives. "Gordon Lonsdale?" Smith asked, blocking their path. Lonsdale stopped. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Yes, I am a police officer. You are all under arrest." The reaction was a study in contrasts. Ethel G. gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in genuine shock. Harry Houghton slunked, the air rushing out of him as if he had been punctured. But Lonsdale didn't flinch. He looked at the detectives with a calm, almost bored appraisal. He didn't try to run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a chess move he had anticipated 10 moves ago. As they were bundled into separate police cars, Lonsdale reportedly turned to Smith and said, "To any specific station, Superintendent? Or do I have a choice?" It was the arrogance of a man who believed he had immunity, or perhaps the resignation of a man who knew the game was up. While Lonsdale and his agents were being processed at Scotland Yard, a second team of detectives was converging on a quiet, tree-lined street in the suburb of Ruislip. Number 45 Cranley Drive was the kind of house that defined English middle-class respectability. It was a bungalow with a manicured lawn, lace curtains, and a nameplate on the gate. The neighbors knew the occupants, Peter and Helen Kroger, as a delightful, if slightly eccentric, elderly couple. Peter was an antiquarian book dealer who spent his days in the garden shed. Helen was a chatty housewife who baked cakes. They were the people you trusted to water your plants when you went on holiday. Superintendent Smith arrived at the house later that evening. When he knocked on the door, Peter Kroger answered. He was wearing a cardigan. He looked confused, blinking behind his thick glasses. "Police?" he asked, his accent a soft blend of Canadian and something else. "Whatever for?" Smith pushed past him into the hallway. "We have reason to believe this house is being used for purposes prejudicial to the safety of the state." Helen Kroger appeared from the kitchen. She was a stout, motherly woman. She saw the detectives swarming her hallway, opening drawers and checking bookshelves. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She did something much more suspicious. She tried to control the room. "This is ridiculous," she huffed. "Peter, tell them to leave." "I'm going to make some tea." "Stay where you are, madam," Smith ordered. Helen paused. She looked at her handbag, which was sitting on the table. "Well, can I at least stoke the fire? It's getting cold in here." She moved toward the bag, reaching for it. Smith was faster. He grabbed the bag before she could touch it. "I'll take that." For the first time, the mask slipped. Helen Kroger's face contorted into a snarl of pure rage. The motherly facade vanished, replaced by the hard, hateful glare of a trapped operative. Inside the handbag, Smith found a glass vial containing microdots tiny photographs of documents shrunk down to the size of a period. If Helen had been allowed to stoke the fire, she would have thrown the bag into the flames, destroying the evidence that linked them to Moscow. The search of 45 Cranley Drive turned into an archaeological dig of espionage. The bungalow was not a home. It was a weapon. The detectives found that the ordinary objects of suburban life had been hollowed out and repurposed. A can of Vim scouring powder in the bathroom had a false bottom. Inside was a cipher pad. A flashlight in the kitchen drawer contained signal plans. A hip flask was actually a container for developing fluid. The Krogers weren't book dealers. They were the technicians of the spy ring, the ones who turned Harry Houghton's stolen papers into invisible dots that could be mailed in a letter. But the real prize was under the floor. In the kitchen, beneath a heavy refrigerator, the detectives found a trapdoor. It led to a concrete pit. Inside the pit was a high-speed radio transmitter, a piece of engineering so powerful it could punch a signal from London to Moscow in a matter of seconds. It was connected to an aerial wire that had been painstakingly threaded through the attic and disguised as a clothesline in the backyard. The detectives stood in awe. This wasn't amateur hour. This was professional-grade infrastructure. The innocent couple next door had been running a direct line to the Kremlin for years, right under the nose of the British establishment. Back at Scotland Yard, the interrogation rooms were full. The police employed a strategy of divide and conquer. They knew Harry Houghton was the weak link. He was an alcoholic, a braggart, and a coward. When they put him in the chair and showed him the shopping bag full of secrets, he didn't hold out. He collapsed. "I was blackmailed," he whined. "They beat me up in Poland. They threatened my wife. I didn't want to do it." Houghton sang. He told them everything about the meetings, the drops, the money. He tried to paint himself as a victim, a patriot forced into treason by sinister forces. He blamed Lonsdale. He blamed Ethel. He blamed everyone but the bottle. Ethel G. was different. She was terrified, but her terror was rooted in naivety. She genuinely seemed to believe the story Harry had told her, that Lonsdale was an American liaison officer. "I thought I was helping the Americans," she sobbed. Harry said it was for the Navy. He said the red tape was slowing things down. The detectives looked at her with a mix of pity and disbelief. It was hard to believe anyone could be that gullible. But Ethel G. was a woman blinded by love for a man who didn't deserve it. She wasn't a master spy. She was just a lonely clerk who wanted to be useful. Gordon Lonsdale was a different species entirely. He sat in the interrogation room with his legs crossed, smoking a cigarette, looking at his captors with a bemused expression. He refused to answer questions. He didn't deny anything. He just didn't age. When they asked him about his name, he said, "I am Gordon Lonsdale, born in Cobalt, Ontario, in 1924. The police checked the records. There was a Gordon Lonsdale born in Cobalt, Ontario. But the real Gordon Lonsdale had surely not grown up to be a Soviet spy. This man was wearing a dead man's identity like a tailored suit. Lonsdale was a professional illegal, an officer of the KGB's first chief directorate. He knew the rules of the game. He knew that if he kept his mouth shut, the Soviet Union would eventually trade for him. He treated the police not as enemies, but as colleagues in a different department. He even complimented Superintendent Smith on the arrest. "You were very good at the station," he said. "I didn't see you until it was too late." It was the ultimate professional courtesy. The technical analysis of the evidence seized at Ruislip revealed the sheer sophistication of the operation. The microdots found in Helen Kroger's bag were a marvel of optical engineering. A standard page of A4 text could be shrunk down to a dot less than a millimeter wide. These dots were then glued onto the full stops of innocuous letters sent to addresses in foreign countries. To the naked eye, it was just a period at the end of a sentence. Under a microscope, it was the schematic for a nuclear submarine reactor. The radio transmitter found under the floor was equally impressive. It used a burst transmission system. Instead of tapping out a long Morse code message that could be triangulated by British counterintelligence, the Krogers would record the message onto a magnetic tape, speed it up until it was just a high-pitched screech, and then blast it out in a split second. By the time the British listening stations picked up the squeal, the transmission was over. It was cutting-edge technology, far ahead of what Khmer 5 expected to find in a suburban bungalow. But the most damning evidence came from the book dealers themselves. As the police dug deeper into the background of Peter and Helen Kroger, the facade crumbled completely. Fingerprint records requested from the FBI in Washington came back with a match that shocked the British authorities. Peter and Helen Kroger were not New Zealanders. They were Morris and Lona Cohen, American communists who had been part of the Rosenberg spy ring in the 1940s. They had helped steal the secrets of the atomic bomb for the Soviets. They had fled the U.S. just before the FBI could arrest them, vanished behind the Iron Curtain, and then resurfaced in London with new faces and new names. They were spy royalty. They had spent their entire adult lives at war with the West. The idea that they were just helping out a friend was laughable. They were the backbone of Soviet illegal operations in the UK. The trial at the Old Bailey in March 1961 was a sensation. The press gallery was packed. The public was hungry for details of the spy ring. It had everything, sex implied, between Houghton and G, gadgets, the microdots and radio, and the mystery of the handsome stranger, Gordon Lonsdale. When the defendants were brought into the dock, the hierarchy was visible. Lonsdale stood at the front, defiant and smiling. The Krogers stood stoically, holding hands, refusing to acknowledge the court's authority. Houghton and G stood at the back, looking broken and small. A prosecutor, the Attorney General himself, laid out the case. He described the ruinous betrayal of the Portland secrets. He showed the jury the tin of talcum powder with the false bottom. He played the tapes of the radio bursts. Houghton's defense was pathetic. He claimed he had been threatened by thugs. He claimed he was trying to work as a double agent. The jury didn't buy it. Ethel G's defense was tragic. She claimed ignorance. "I did it for Harry," she said, over and over again. But Lonsdale stole the show. In a moment of calculated drama, he took the stand and tried to take the blame for everything. He claimed the Krogers were innocent, that he had simply rented a room in their house and stored his equipment there without their knowledge. He claimed Ethel G knew nothing. He tried to save his team. It was a noble lie, but a futile one. The evidence of the Krogers' involvement, the signal plans in the flashlight, the cipher pads in the bathroom, was overwhelming. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. The sentencing was severe. Gordon Lonsdale, 25 years. Peter and Helen Kroger, 20 years each. Harry Houghton, 15 years. Ethel G, 15 years. As the judge read out the sentences, a gasp went through the courtroom. These were some of the longest sentences ever handed down for espionage in British history. But as Lonsdale was led away to the cells, he turned to the gallery and winked. He knew something the judge didn't. He knew that 25 years was just a number on a piece of paper. He was a colonel in the KGB. He was valuable. And he knew that the game wasn't over just because he was in handcuffs. The chessboard was still in play, and he was a piece the Soviets would want back. Before we cross the Iron Curtain to witness one of the most famous spy swaps in history, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep digging into these declassified files and bringing you the true stories of the Cold War. The gates of HM Prison Wormwood Scrubs in London slammed shut with a finality that usually signaled the end of a man's life. But for Gordon Lonsdale, it was merely a change of venue. He was prisoner 3684, serving a 25-year sentence for espionage. Yet he walked the galleries of the Victorian prison, not like a convict, but like a visiting dignitary who was temporarily inconvenienced by the accommodations. While Harry Houghton fell apart in captivity, dissolving into self-pity and whining to anyone who would listen about how he had been framed, Lonsdale thrived. He became the king of the scrubs. He charmed the guards with the same easy charisma that had fooled the London party set. He organized illicit networks within the prison walls, trading cigarettes and extra food with the efficiency of a quartermaster. He even managed to befriend George Blake, another Soviet super spy who was serving a 42-year sentence in the same cell block. Lonsdale's confidence stemmed from a single unshakable belief: he was currency. In the brutal economy of the Cold War, a high-ranking KGB officer was a valuable asset, a poker chip to be held until the other side picked up something of equal value. He knew the Soviet Union would not leave him to rot in an English jail. He was a hero of the state, a man who had stolen the secrets of the British nuclear deterrent. He told his fellow inmates, with a wink and a smile, that he would be out in a few years. They thought he was delusional. He knew he was just waiting for the market to correct itself. But the market required a trade. For the British and Americans to release a spy of Lonsdale's caliber, the Soviets needed to capture a Western agent of significant importance. The KGB went hunting. They didn't have to look far. In November 1962, Greville Wynne, a British businessman who had been acting as a courier for the West's most valuable asset, Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, was snatched off the streets of Budapest. He was drugged, thrown into a van, and driven to Moscow. Penkovsky was executed, but Wynne was kept alive. He was put on trial, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 8 years in a Soviet labor camp. The board was set. The Soviets had their chip. The negotiations for the swap were slow, conducted in the shadows by lawyers and diplomats who spoke in the euphemisms of humanitarian transfers. The British government was reluctant. They wanted Lonsdale to serve his time. They wanted to punish the man who had humiliated MI5. But the pressure to bring Wynne home was immense. Wynne's health was deteriorating in the harsh conditions of the Lubyanka prison. The deal was struck. One master spy for one businessman. It wasn't a fair trade in terms of intelligence value. Lonsdale was a professional. Wynne was an amateur courier, but democracies are sentimental about their citizens. The Soviets knew this, and they exploited it ruthlessly. April 22, 1964. Berlin. The Heerstraige checkpoint was not as famous as Checkpoint Charlie, but on this damp, gray morning, it was the center of the world. The sky was a bruised purple, hanging low over the divided city. The air smelled of wet asphalt and lignite coal. On the west side, a convoy of British diplomatic cars waited, engines idling. Inside one of them sat Gordon Lonsdale. He was wearing a suit that had been returned to him from storage, smelling faintly of mothballs. He looked rested, healthy, and remarkably relaxed. He smoked a cigarette, watching the border guards with a detached amusement. On the east side, a Soviet convoy appeared out of the mist. Inside was Greville Wynne. He looked like a broken man. He had lost weight. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by the psychological torture of the KGB interrogation cells. The contrast between the two men was a stark visual representation of the two systems. Lonsdale, the professional, had treated prison as a job. Wynne, the civilian, had been crushed by it. The protocol for a spy swap is a rigid, almost ceremonial affair. There were no handshakes, no speeches. At a signal, the car doors opened. Lonsdale stepped out onto the tarmac. He didn't look back at the west. He walked toward the demarcation line with a confident stride. Wynne was helped out of his car, shuffling slowly. The two men passed each other in the middle of the road. They didn't speak. They didn't acknowledge each other. They were ships passing in the geopolitical night, their values determined by men in offices thousands of miles away. As Lonsdale crossed into the Soviet sector, a pair of KGB officers stepped forward. They didn't hug him. They shook his hand firmly, guided him into a waiting Volga sedan, and the car sped away toward the airport. Gordon Lonsdale, the Canadian businessman, the jukebox salesman, the prisoner, was dead. He had ceased to exist the moment he crossed that line. In his place sat Colonel Conan Malady of the KGB. The mask was finally off. The true identity of Gordon Lonsdale was a secret that British intelligence had been trying to crack for 3 years. When he arrived in Moscow, the KGB allowed the world a glimpse of the truth. He was not Canadian. He was not a Lonsdale. He was Conan Trofimovich Malady, born in Moscow in 1922. But the twist, the detail that explained his perfect English, his easy charm, and his ability to pass as a Westerner was his childhood. In 1932, at the age of 10, Malady had been sent to live with an aunt in California. He grew up in Berkeley. He attended American schools. He played baseball. He listened to jazz. He absorbed the culture, the slang, and the psychology of the West, not from a textbook, but from living it. He was an American teenager in every way that mattered, except for his loyalty. He returned to the Soviet Union in 1938, just before the war, but the American persona was burned into his hard drive. When the KGB recruited him, they realized they had a unicorn, a loyal Soviet officer who could think, talk, and act like a capitalist native. His return to Moscow was hailed as a triumph. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. He was given a comfortable apartment and a dacha in the countryside. He was paraded before young KGB recruits as the ideal illegal, the man who had lived in the belly of the beast and stolen its fire. But for Conan Malady, the homecoming was bittersweet. He had spent his entire adult life living on the edge, fueled by adrenaline and the intellectual challenge of the double life. Now he was a bureaucrat. He was a lecturer. The thrill was gone. He missed London. He missed the freedom of the West, the parties, the women, the sheer variety of life that was absent in the drab conformity of Brezhnev's Russia. He began to drink heavily, echoing the flaw of the man he had recruited, Harry Houghton. Friends described him as restless, a man pacing a cage of his own making. He wrote a memoir, heavily censored by the KGB, and tried to find purpose in training the next generation of spies, but the spark was fading. The king of the scrubs was now just another pensioner of the state. He died of a heart attack in 1970, just 6 years after the swap, at the age of 48. He was burying mushrooms in a field, a mundane end for a man who had lived a dozen lives. While Lonsdale was toasting his freedom with vodka in Moscow, the other members of the Portland spy ring were waking up to the grim reality of a British prison cell. For Peter and Helen Kroger, or Morris and Lona Cohen, as they were now known, the swap was a betrayal. They had expected to be included. They were, after all, veterans of the cause. They had stolen the atomic bomb secrets. They had run the radio for Lonsdale. They were heroes of the Soviet Union, in secret. Why were they left behind? The Krogers were bitter. They sat in their separate prisons, refusing to cooperate with British intelligence, refusing to admit their true identities, holding on to the hope that the KGB would come back for them. But the market for spies had cooled. The British were furious about the Lonsdale wind trade. They felt they had been shortchanged. They weren't going to give up the Krogers for anything less than a king's ransom. The pressure on the Krogers was immense. Mi-5 visited them regularly, offering deals. "Tell us who your other contacts were," the agent said. "Tell us how the radio codes worked, and we might recommend leniency." But the Krogers were made of granite. Helen Kroger, the woman who had tried to hit a policeman with her handbag, was particularly formidable. She ran her wing of the women's prison with an iron fist, terrifying the other inmates and frustrating the guards. She maintained her innocence, maintained her fake identity, and waited. It took 5 years for the wheel to turn again. In 1969, the Soviet Union arrested a young British lecturer named Gerald Brooke. Brooke was a naive academic who had been caught smuggling anti-Soviet pamphlets into Russia for an émigré group. It was a minor offense, usually punishable by deportation. But the KGB saw an opportunity. They threatened to put Brooke on trial for espionage. They threatened to sentence him to decades in the Gulag. They began to hint, through back channels, that Brooke's health was failing, that he might not survive a Russian winter. The message to London was clear. You want the boy back? Give us the Krogers. The British government was outraged. It was blackmail, pure and simple. Trading 2 master spies, who had done incalculable damage to national security, for a foolish student who had handed out some leaflets. It was an absurd exchange rate. The press howled in protest. The intelligence services argued that it would encourage the Soviets to arrest innocent tourists whenever they needed to free a spy. But the humanitarian argument won out. The image of a young British man dying in a Siberian camp was too politically damaging. So, in October 1969, another plane landed on a foggy runway. The Krogers, now elderly and frail, walked up the stairs. They were flown to Poland, and then to Moscow. When they arrived, they were not greeted by a simple handshake. They were greeted with flowers, medals, and a private reception with the head of the KGB. They were given the hero's welcome that Lonsdale had received. They were finally home, in a country they hadn't seen in 30 years, a country they had served with a religious devotion from the suburbs of London. And what of the lovers? What of the drunk clerk and the lonely spinster who had started it all? Harry Houghton and Ethel G. were not swapped. They were not Russians. They were British traitors, and the Soviet Union had no use for them. They were left to serve their time, despised by their countrymen and ignored by their former paymasters. Houghton's time in prison was a misery. He was bullied. He was isolated. The bravado of the man who bought the bar evaporated, leaving a sad, bitter old man who wrote letters to the newspapers, claiming he had been a double agent all along. Ethel G. fared better. She was a model prisoner. She worked in the prison library. She kept her head down. But she never renounced Harry. In a twist that baffled everyone, the police, the press, and the public, her love for the man who had ruined her life did not waver. She wrote to him constantly. She planned for their future. She believed, against all evidence, that Harry loved her, that he hadn't just used her to get access to the vault. They were released in 1970 and 1971, respectively. They were middle-aged, unemployable, and notorious. They had no money. The KGB cash was long gone. They had no friends, but they had each other. In a final act of defiance against a world that judged them, Harry Houghton and Ethel G. got married. They changed their names, moved to a nondescript house on the coast, and tried to disappear. It was a strange, melancholy ending to the affair. There were no more secrets, no more microdots, no more trips to London. Just two aging ex-cons living in a small house, arguing about the washing up, bound together by a crime that had once threatened to start World War III. The Portland spy ring was broken. The players were scattered dead in Moscow, retired in Russia, or hiding in Dorset. But the damage they had done was permanent. They had shattered the illusion of British security. They had proven that the establishment could be outsmarted by a suburban couple and a drunk clerk. And in the vaults of MI5, a new paranoia took root. If Harry Houghton could steal the nuclear deterrent, who else was watching? The hunt for the enemy within was just beginning, and the ghost of the Portland Ring would haunt the intelligence services for decades to come. While the British public was consuming the salacious details of the Portland trial, the microdots, the secret lovers, the suburban spies, a different kind of trial was taking place behind the closed doors of the Admiralty and the Pentagon. The conviction of the Portland Five was a victory for MI5, but for the United States Navy, it was a catastrophe. The secrets that Harry Houghton had stuffed into Ethel G's shopping bag were not merely British secrets. They were American secrets on loan. The centerpiece of the theft was the HMS Dreadnought. Britain's first nuclear-powered submarine was built using an American reactor design. The S-5W pressurized water reactor, provided by the U.S. under a highly sensitive technology-sharing agreement. Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the father of the nuclear navy and a man known for his ferocious obsession with secrecy, had opposed the deal from the start. He believed the British were lax, riddled with communist sympathizers, and incapable of keeping a lid on the technology. The Portland spy ring proved him right in the most humiliating way possible. When the damage assessment was finally completed in Washington, the results were chilling. The KGB hadn't just stolen the blueprints for the hull. They had stolen the acoustic signature of the reactor. They knew exactly how much noise the Dreadnought made at 10 knots. They knew the cavitation points of the propellers. They knew the specific frequency of the sonar arrays designed to hunt Soviet subs. In the silent, blind game of underwater warfare, knowledge is the only weapon that matters. If you know what the enemy sounds like, you can kill him before he even knows you are there. The Portland betrayal effectively nullified a decade of Western naval superiority. The Soviet Union, which had been struggling to build quiet nuclear submarines, suddenly leaped forward in their design. Their new Victor and Charlie-class submarines, which appeared in the late 1960s, bore a suspicious acoustic resemblance to the American designs stolen from Portland. The gap had closed. The Atlantic Ocean, once a NATO lake, was now a contested battleground. And it was all because a clerk in Dorset wanted money to buy a new Vauxhall and drink double gins. The diplomatic fallout was freezing. The special relationship between British and American intelligence went into the deep freeze. The CIA and the U.S. Navy stopped sharing their most sensitive raw data with their British cousins. They viewed MI5 not as a partner, but as a sieve. It would take years, and the rise of new threats, for trust to be rebuilt. The drunk clerk hadn't just sold files. He had sold the reputation of an empire. The arrest of the Portland Ring solved one problem but created a much darker one inside the corridors of MI5. As the interrogators picked through the wreckage of the network, they began to notice inconsistencies. Gordon Lonsdale Conan Malady was a brilliant operative, but he wasn't a magician. How had he known exactly when to push Houghton? How had the Krogers managed to operate their high-speed transmitter for years without the British Signal Intelligence Service, GCHQ, picking up the bursts? There were whispers of a protector, a mole. The timing of the arrests was suspicious. Lonsdale had been pushing for a final big haul in early 1961, almost as if he knew the net was closing. During his interrogation, Lonsdale had played mind games with Peter Wright, the MI5 scientist and counterintelligence officer. He hinted that he knew more about Mi-5's internal structure than he should. He made jokes about specific officers. It was the kind of taunting that keeps spycatchers awake at night. The Portland case became the first domino in a cascade of paranoia that would tear British intelligence apart for the next 20 years. It led directly to the formation of the Fluency Committee, a secret working group dedicated to finding Soviet penetrations within the service. It cast suspicion on Roger Hollis, the Director General of MI5 himself. The logic was brutal. The Portland Ring was too successful, too comfortable. They acted like men who had read the other side's playbook. This paranoia was the KGB's final lingering gift. Even from a prison cell, Lonsdale was destroying the efficiency of his enemies. By planting the seed of doubt, he ensured that MI5 would spend the next decade chasing its own tail, investigating its own officers, and paralyzing its operations in a hunt for a third man, a fourth man, and a fifth man. The Portland Ring was the infection that caused the autoimmune disease of the 1970s, where the British services turned on themselves in a frenzy of suspicion. While the geopolitical tectonic plates were shifting, Harry Houghton and Ethel G. were navigating the small, sad geography of their post-prison lives. They were released in the early 1970s, blinking into a world that had moved on. The swinging 60s had happened while they were locking in cells. England was a different place. But they were the same. In a move that stunned the public, they married. It was a union forged in the crucible of mutual disgrace. They changed their names to Barclay, perhaps a subconscious nod to the childhood home of their spymaster, Lonsdale. They didn't flee to Moscow. The Soviets had made it clear there was no Dasha waiting for incompetent drunks, and they couldn't afford to live abroad. So they moved to a caravan park and later a small, nondescript cottage in Dorset, not far from the scene of their crimes. Their domestic life was a bizarre study in denial. They lived quietly, but the stigma of traitor is a tattoo that never fades. The neighbors knew who they were. The local pubs, the very places where Houghton had once held court as the big spender, were now hostile territory. Bricks were thrown through their windows. They lived behind drawn curtains, two aging pariahs bound together by a secret that had ruined them. Houghton spent his remaining years trying to rewrite history. He wrote a memoir, Operation Portland, in which he spun a fantastical yarn about being a double agent, claiming he had been working for Chinese intelligence, or that he was trying to expose lax security. It was the rambling of a man who could not face the reality of his own greed. He died in 1985, a lonely, bitter figure. Ethel G., the loyal accomplice who had carried the shopping bag, nursed him to the end and lived on for a few more years, a silent witness to the banality of evil. They were not monsters. They were small, broken people who had been crushed by the weight of the game they tried to play. Thousands of miles away, in the gray concrete sprawl of Moscow, the man who had orchestrated their ruin was meeting his own strange end. Conan Malady, the dashing Gordon Lonsdale, had not adjusted well to life as a hero of the Soviet Union. The transition from the adrenaline-fueled life of an illegal in London to the stifling bureaucracy of the KGB headquarters was fatal to his spirit. He drank. He engaged in reckless affairs. He openly criticized the incompetence of the Soviet leadership, comparing the drab reality of Moscow unfavorably to the vibrancy of London. In a totalitarian state, this was dangerous behavior, even for a hero. The KGB didn't know what to do with him. He was a poster boy for their success, but a liability in the officers' mess. In October 1970, Konon Molody went mushroom picking in a field outside Moscow. He was 48 years old, seemingly healthy, though worn down by the stress of his imprisonment. He collapsed and died. The official cause was a heart attack. It was a plausible explanation. The life of a spy is hard on the heart. But in the wilderness of mirrors that is the intelligence world, rumors persist. Did he know too much? Was he planning to defect back to the West, driven by his nostalgia for jazz and freedom? Or did he simply burn out, a bulb that had shone too brightly for too long? He was buried with full military honors. A postage stamp was issued with his likeness. He became a legend in the KGB training academies, the gold standard of the illegal. But those who knew him best said that Gordon Lonsdale died the day he walked across that bridge in Berlin. The man who lived in Moscow was just a shell, haunting the jazz clubs, dreaming of a Studebaker and a rainy afternoon at Waterloo Station. The Portland spy ring closed the book on the age of innocence. Before Harry Houghton, there was a gentlemanly assumption that security was a matter of character. If you were British, if you were a civil servant, you were trustworthy. Security vetting was a chat over a cup of tea. Background checks were cursory. The idea that a middle-aged woman with a knitting bag could be walking out with the blueprints to the apocalypse was considered rude to suggest. After Portland, the Romer Committee tore the security establishment apart. The positive vetting system was introduced. It was brutal, invasive, and paranoid. Civil servants were probed about their sex lives, their finances, their drinking habits. The need-to-know principle became a religion. The trust was gone, replaced by the cold, mechanical surveillance of the internal security state. The physical legacy of the ring is also still with us. The technology the Krogers used to burst transmission, the microdot accelerated the arms race in spycraft. It forced the British and Americans to develop better listening stations, better encryption, and better detection methods. It was the beginning of the technological Cold War, where the battle wasn't fought by men in trench coats, but by satellites and supercomputers. But the ultimate lesson of the Portland spy ring is not about technology. It is about the human factor. The KGB didn't break into the underwater base with lasers or commandos. They walked in through the front door, invited by a man who felt undervalued and overthirsty. They exploited the simplest, most ancient vulnerabilities: greed, ego, and loneliness. Today, the Isle of Portland is quiet. The naval base is gone, closed down at the end of the Cold War. The bunkers where the nuclear secrets were kept are now tourist attractions or industrial units. The cottage where Harry and Ethel plotted their treason is just another house on a windswept hill. But in the training manuals of intelligence agencies around the world, the name Houghton is still a warning. It reminds every new recruit that the greatest threat to national security isn't always the master spy with the silenced pistol. Sometimes it's the boring man in the corner of the office, the one who laughs a little too loud, the one who stays a little too late, the one who always buys the first round with a roll of cash that is just a little too thick. The drunk clerk didn't just uncover a spy ring. He showed us the reflection in the mirror. And 50 years later, we are still checking the locks, wondering who else is packing a shopping bag with our secrets.